Right. Well, we're now actually moving to work package 6, which is production of cultural events. One of its outputs was a theater play that was staged in Madrid. And another output, the second output, is an exhibition about war that will be inaugurated in November 2018 at the Ruhr Museum Essen. So none of our colleagues from Essen is here, but we are working in close collaboration with them on this exhibition. Now, if doing an agonistic exhibition about war, I think the first question one can ask is, why should we do an agonistic exhibition? And in this context, I'll actually go back to the theory on agonism and try to build a case for the need for agonism in a war museum. And I'll also say some things about how to do such an exhibition. But I'll throw actually this particular hot potato about how to do it to Wulf, who will address more concretely this issue in the second part of the presentation. And at the same time, my focus on the theory and means that actually part of my presentation is closely linked with the very first presentation we heard this morning from Hans and Anna, which was at least part of it more theoretical. Now, going back to MOVE and starting with MOVE, so MOVE's agonistic democracy is constructed as a response to the, quote, emergence of a new hegemonic project, that of liberal conservative discourse, which seeks to articulate the neoliberal defense of the free market economy with a profoundly anti-egalitarian cultural and social traditions of conservatism, and which would also legitimize inequalities and restore the hierarchical relations which struggles of previous decades had destroyed, end quote. Now, MOVE herself does not speak about memory studies. Nevertheless, the emergence of neoliberalism in the 1970s, the dismantling of the welfare state, and the casting away of social democratic ideas are processes concurrent and inextricably linked with the dissolution of the anti-fascist post-war consensus in memory politics. Now, on the one hand, challenging the tenets of the post-war anti-fascist settlement entailed shedding light upon societal division during the Second World War, collaboration with Nazism, participation in the Holocaust throughout the whole of Europe, all issues that had been to a large extent taboo up until towards the end of the Cold War in both the western and the eastern parts of the continent, although for different reasons. At the same time, this phenomenon is connected with the ascendancy of Holocaust history and memory. So the Holocaust turned into a moral and historiographic starting point for the new historiography of the post-war, a foundational past, while its memory became the central reference point in the global age. At the same time, this reconsideration of the post-war anti-fascist consensus, of the anti-fascist post-war consensus, is also connected to a growing historiographic revisionism, implicitly or explicitly equating Nazism and communism, and also to memory discourses and memory politics, which blur the lines between perpetrators and victims, and also to a significant increase of the appeal of anti-fascism. And this, so in this context, the changes and the reconfiguration related to memories of war have also been accompanied by the far-right's re-emergence on the political level. Neoliberalism has, I'm now using the work of Enzo Calverso, has appropriated and privatized utopias and has replaced the future-oriented principle of hope with a present-oriented principle of responsibility. And by situating everything in a never-ending present, it has undone the potential for revolutionary transformation, a phenomenon that's also linked with the decomposition of left-wing social bases and memories. And concretely, we quote Enzo Calverso, the memory of the Gulag erased that of the revolution, the memory of the Holocaust replaced that of anti-fascism, and the memory of slavery replaced that of anti-colonialism. The remembrance of the victims seems unable to coexist with the recollection of their hopes, of their struggles, of their conquests and defeats. End quote. So the focus on victimhood obliterates the political, social and economic conflicts underlying the history of 20th century wars, and thus creates the conditions of possibility for the erasure of the emancipatory struggles in the past. At the same time, this means that it curtails the potential of these struggles to provide anchor points for present and future emancipatory efforts. And together with the repudiation of the left-wing socialist and communist traditions and political projects, this can easily lead to a leveling of all victims. And at the same time, as I was saying, this process is tightly connected with the equation of Nazism and communism as two faces of the same evil. And this is a phenomenon, a process, which conveniently forgets the genocidal colonial tradition that Nazism can be connected with, and it also eschews acknowledging or addressing in any way the links between liberal capitalism and imperialism. So this would be the background against which Anna and Hans developed their agonistic memory, so drawing on move. And they indicate that contemporary liberal cosmopolitan memory discourses emphasizing transnationalism, human rights, universalism, and putatively contributing to the imposition of a human rights regime on the global scale have not managed to restrain the emergence of antagonistic nationally bounded memory discourses. And I think that's also one of the main ideas that we heard in Stefan's presentation earlier this morning. So in the absence of a sustained critique of liberal cosmopolitanism coming from the left, such antagonistic discourses have actually gained momentum. So in this context, agonistic memory aims to practically broaden the scope of politics of memory and of memory discourses, and to account for conflict and struggle and existing antagonisms, whilst at the same time to open up towards contingency and undecidability, towards silent and silenced memory cultures, whilst also aiming to include the voices of bystanders, spies, and other ambivalent figures. And one of the stakes of agonistic memory, as well as I see, is that of resuscitating radical counter-hegemonic discourses, which can enable a critique of both present and past, both past and present power relations. Now, if we consider that museums are sites of conflict and spaces of continuous cultural and political struggles, then they can definitely be conceptualized as potential agonistic spaces. And because a multiplicity of past historical experiences and the controversies these experiences have provoked and continue to provoke are prime examples of polyvocality and of interpretive incongruities. And this is precisely a key part of the raw material, let's say, that agonism and agonistic memory are supposed to work with. So an agonistic museum experience and an agonistic exhibition takes place at confounding intersections and brings to the fore dissonances and clashes in the absence of definitive criteria for the making of judgments, let's say the open-endedness of agonism. And proceeding from the assumption that total consensus postulated by deliberative democracy is conceptually impossible, elaborations on museums and exhibitions as agonistic spaces fundamentally look for ways in which contingent provisional agreements can be presented in museums as ongoing conversations. And as I was saying, conversations of the sort are pragmatically open-ended, and at the same time they are paradoxical as they enable, or they should enable museums to stage confrontations between conflicting positions, and thus, going back to Wulf's agonism, they are meant to provide opportunities for the imagination and cultivation of radical democratic alternatives to neoliberalism. If attempting to embrace agonism, the exhibition of war in museums, in this context, if attempting to embrace agonism, the exhibition of war in museums ought to refuse the humanitarian, righteous yet powerless pity which underlies the cosmopolitan mode of remembering, and at the same time undermines the constitution of a critical practice. So as I was saying, the recourse to agonism has to be understood as a modality by which critical counter-hegemonic discourses and practices are made part of the conversation. And this, we would argue, implies staging three types of interrelated confrontational conversations. On the one hand, that between conflicting perspectives on wars from the time when the wars were taking place, how war made or made not sense for those involved. Secondly, conflicting historiographic interpretations of war, that is, making sense of war. And thirdly, confrontations between conflicting memory discourses about wars, or how war is now made into sense. And the perspectives to be made part of the conversations ought to include perspectives moving beyond the perpetrator-victim dichotomy, which is very typical of contemporary war memories, They also include counter-hegemonic historiographic interpretations, silent, silenced, and hidden memories. Because such acts of inclusion can provide impulses. Such acts of inclusion can provide impulses towards the production of alternatives to both contemporary cosmopolitan hegemonies, cosmopolitan neoliberal hegemonies, but also alternatives to the retreat towards conservatism, religiosity, nationalism, and fascism that seems to be developed as the main force opposing the former. So, socialist anti-militarism, left-wing internationalism, and other types of transnational solidarities, anti-fascism, counter-interpretations of liberalism, emphasis on links between capitalism and war, or between market rule and fascism, forgotten working class memories. All these should be presented and addressed within an exhibition that aims to be true, let's say, to the tenets of agonism, and which also aims to broaden the scope of the dialogue, which appears in the present to be circumscribed by, on the one hand, the neoliberal hegemony, so by a neoliberal hegemony which is under attack by antagonistic nationalism, but at the same time seems ready to find ways to coexist with this particular antagonistic nationalism. That was my part, Wulf.
Yeah, good.
Thank you.
That's still all very theoretical, and pleasantly so, right? Because as long as we do theories from our academic point of view, we don't have to commit ourselves. Now, unfortunately, the project has given us the responsibility of trying to be more concrete, and we have been meeting as academics and with the team at the Ruhr Museum in Essen regularly. And we have also recently, and this is why this is very much in flux, we have just about 4 weeks ago had a meeting where we invited a number of historians primarily, but also memory studies experts, to respond to our work in progress. And one of the responses, one of the results of that meeting was that we changed our plans. And that's why we're also not particularly concrete at the moment. But I will try to outline as best as I can both what our parameters are at the moment and what I would also perceive as some of the very interesting challenges that we are facing, challenges that I think have also become clear, some of them have become clear, I think, in the course of our discussions today. So our step has been that all along, as we have been trying to get a grip on what an agonistic exhibit might be, we have been trying to formulate some concrete guidelines of what should that thing do. And they have also been shifting, but so I'm now trying to summarize where we are. The first one is the decisive decision I think we have taken in our last meeting is that we are moving a little bit from memory to history. Because one of our points of departure is that we try to address the seeming consensus of the meaninglessness of war. A consensus, a post-World War II consensus, a Holocaust memory-linked consensus, that we take that as our point of departure to complicate it and to deconstruct it. And so our task is then, if I take Sophia's terminology here, we would be engaging with multi-perspectivity, that is, multiple takes on warfare with regard to a number of different events at the time when they occurred, so before and during the conflicts. At the moment, we are looking still at a wide spectrum of conflicts. My expectation is that we will not be able to cover all of them. We begin with World War I, obviously because the opening date of the exhibit is planned to be the end of World War I, and therefore we need that as our anchoring point. We move on to World War II, and then to post-war wars, the wars in former Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, and Syria. That's, so to speak, the palette that we agreed upon. I'm not sure yet anybody has really decided how many of these conflicts we'll be able to cover. I also think, so one of the first ways in which we're trying to respond is to add complexity, to add historical complexity to decisions to go to war. And we do this on the assumption that this consensus, there is a certain cosmopolitan consensus that is fairly widely shared, and not necessarily very stable. That is, a consensus that war is bad, that war is problematic, built on the basis of World War II memory more than anything else, and that coexists without any problems, coexists with warfare today. Right? So I think, for example, to give you just one example for that tenet where we feel it's very popular, is, for example, European societies and politicians are very critical of the United States for leading us into one war after another. But that criticism can easily coexist with participation of European forces at the same time, right? So this is somewhat unstable, but I think it's nevertheless a widely shared value. So we want to historicize that, we want to contextualize it, we want to complicate it. Why do people go to war? Why do they resist? And on that level, that is, there is going to be, of course, one touching point that is very tricky to deconstruct, and I think was also tricky to see how far we can push it. And that is with regard to the Nazi experience with regard to World War II. Now, when it comes to these are the 5 events on which we want to draw. We also want to do this, trying to approach this by way of 4 to 5 different topical foci. One of them is aerial warfare with regard to different conflicts. Another one is the question of refugees and the question of ethnic cleansing with regard to different conflicts. And the conclusion of the war, how do wars end? And the final one is the question of genocide. And this combination, then if you have those registers, right, the 5 conflicts, our 4 to 5 topics, then it's very, very clear that one of the problematic points is how far do you go in justifying, for example, genocide? How much multi-perspectivity do we want to introduce? How much do we feel comfortable with? My take at the moment, and this is somewhat subjective, my take at this moment is we will probably do something that we have already been talking about today implicitly, that is, we craft a compromise. I wouldn't be surprised if the exhibit, when it comes to representing World War I and World War II, will include significant elements of cosmopolitan memory. Because I assume also that we will be coming up against limits of comfort zones of the institution, and I think very justifiably so. We have heard several times today about the realities of museum exhibits, and I would also assume that when we come to more contemporary wars, that we have much more possibilities to include voices, perhaps also voices of surprise, into the setting. That is, when it comes to referring to the wars in Yugoslavia, when it comes to Syria as a contemporary example, in Afghanistan, then we can also invite into the museum voices which are maybe not generally represented there, and we can do this with a full range of perspectives without having really those clear limitations that I think we find in Germany, especially perhaps with regard to the Holocaust. Now, I want to perhaps highlight one of the questions, as I perceive it, which is a very, very interesting, again, a very interesting theoretical, but also a very interesting practical point of view, which is linked to the question of taboos and limits. I see that we are operating with different notions of agonism. And I think also the voices, the language that you use is very nice. On the one hand, our agonism is somewhat to be open-ended. This is one of the terms that you use. And on the other hand, the more orthodox we are, the more we're referring to MOVE, the less open-ended it actually is, right? I mean, in MOVE, it's supposed to be multi-perspectival and multi-vocal perhaps, but at the very same time, it should result in a left-wing victory. So in that sense, we have at the same time that it's open-ended, it's scripted. The result is scripted, and this is a political struggle that we better win. And I think most of us will agree with that, but we really want to win that struggle. On the other hand, of course, and this makes I think the concept even more interesting than its author. I think on the other hand, we are operating at times with what I would call a structural agonism. And then that is more open-ended, and that raises a very, very interesting question which we have discussed at length in our group also. To what extent is it does it make sense to invite into the space of the museum, for example, voices of today right-wing activists, right? To what extent would that be a political strategy? Does it make sense to invite the AfD voices into the space of the museum, where grantedly they have had not much of a presence? And would we do this, would we be willing to do this in a somewhat open-ended way, because the broadening of the spectrum of permissible voices is a value in and of itself, all by hoping, of course, that by doing so, we still have a good chance of winning the political competition. I think there's a very interesting tension between these two elements of agonism, and we have not found yet a perfect solution to that yet, how far we can go.
There are some internal agonistic confrontations.
Antagonistic.
Agonistic.
That's open to interpretation. Yes. Two final points. One of the things we're very much hoping to be able to do, especially with regard to the most recent, most recent conflicts, is that we can focus and zoom on activating feelings, on activating emotions. And here we do, I think we have complete consensus that we can integrate, for instance, fear of refugees as one of the decisive voices here. So perhaps to summarize it at this point in time, I think what we can do with regard to World War II and World War I is to contextualize much more than has been done so far. I think we can add much more complexity to the question of the perpetrators. Who are the perpetrators? Why have they acting the way they did? We can add a lot of complexity to the decision of going to war, for example, against the Nazis. That, I think, would be very easy. With regard to the most recent conflicts, there I think we could be much more provocative and maybe also much more surprising.